At the same time, because it is where I live and work and think things through, this book skews towards the Americas. Most of the words in this book describe people, but some, like camp and sanctuary, describe places or practices that affect them. Each word has a corresponding section for further reading in the back matter. Listed there are sources I consulted, as well as suggestions for deeper learning about these issues. Also to be found in the back matter is a list of advocacy organizations of, by, and for people on the move. Everyone I have described this book to has had suggestion for entries. I've not been able to include them all. A fine thing to do with a table of contents would be to read it for what you think I have left out, and then imagine how to go about including that in your conversations, classes, or organizing work. As with the limitations on specific words to appear in this book, it was not possible to translate it into the myriad language spoken by people on the move. The decision to present this book in facing page translation to Spanish recognizes the number of Spanish-dominant readers in the United States and elsewhere who have deep investments in these words. Because the Spanish translation appears on the recto or right side of the book, anyone opening it is likely to see the Spanish first. That's meant as a gesture of solidarity to non-English speakers in general and to people on the move in particular. You don't have to read this book from start to finish. It's meant as a reference work to correct the de-meaning of terms and rhetoric, law, and policies based on dehumanization, hate, and profitable incarceration. You can read it like a cookbook, picking out the parts that are useful to you. Each section ends with a list of see also suggestions. Follow them if you like. You can read this book from the end to the beginning, open it and close it, stick it in your backpack for later, apply as necessary. This book recognizes no national borders drawn by settler colonial occupiers as legitimate. This book opens its arms to all those crossing and trying to cross such borders. This book invites those living in detention, shelters, and camps to come on in. This book aids and abets advocates in offering people on the move legal, medical, and humanitarian assistance. This book knowingly conspires to amplify collective well-being, truth, and witness over the lying din of white supremacy. This book traffics in solidarity. It dreams in the many languages of liberation. Okay, and then I'm just going to read the sort of first part of the story about itinerant, which, as I said, takes place in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638. In the Treaty of Hartford that ended the Pequot War, victorious British settler colonists stipulate that Pequot settlers of this bloody conflict must renounce claims to their ancestral territories, and that they can never utter the name of their nation again. The treaty sends 200 surviving Pequots to Narragansett and Mohican nations allied with the British as captives. Many others are sold into slavery in the British Caribbean. Dispossessed from their lands, towns, and families, many Pequots find refuge in the margins of colonial New England. They join communities made up of other indigenous people, as well as escaped indentured servants, formerly enslaved Africans and African Americans, and impoverished or rowdy white residents of townships who were warned out and forced to leave their homes by local selectmen, like the ones meeting in Wellfleet tomorrow night, just saying. Sites of solidarity and subsistence, these multiracial communities exist at the margins of colonial New England society. Some Pequot established long-term residences in busy colonial hubs like New Bedford, Massachusetts, where there's abundant work in the global whaling industry. Some head west or north, seeking refuge with indigenous people living beyond the bounds of British New England. Others managed to remain on the lands that had once been theirs, subsisting while covertly maintaining their identity. Many become itinerant, following seasonal cycles and earning their living by picking crops, fixing tools, and producing needed implements such as baskets. As the newly independent United States recognizes the partial sovereignty of American Indians as domestic dependent nations in the early 19th century, their forced dispersal posed challenges for New England indigenous nations seeking to establish sovereignty under federal Indian law. A legal and historical contradictions places the marginal, often itinerant status of indigenous people in opposition to the law's emphasis on stability and long-term occupancy, obscuring their legitimate claims. Can subsistence farmers, maritime workers, or itinerant laborers be recognized as members of sovereign nations with a legal claim to the land? After the Federal Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988, Mashantuck Pequot Indians worked to have their sovereignty, deliberately hidden since 1638, federally recognized. The result? Foxwoods, the most successful casino in the nation. The Pequot Nation uses part of their casino profits to build and operate the Mashantuck Pequot Museum and Resource Center, a monument to Indigenous memory and persistence. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Alejandra for a little bit.
Thank you so much for that reading, Rachel. That's probably one of my favorite parts, and I think part of the translation test that I did for the book, and so also one of the earliest parts that I read, and so it's really perfect tonight. I'm going to read a little bit of my translator's note. I first met Rachel Buff in January 2019 on a dreary morning at El Chaparral, a plaza that is also the hub for most of the border crossing in Tijuana. There, I got to see Rachel in action, watching everything, making it clear to families and individuals waiting to cross that she was ready to be helpful however they needed her. Holding babies, playing with children, carrying bags, lending out a cell phone. Reading A is for Asylum Seeker replicates the experience of watching Rachel at El Chaparral and the long conversations over dinner with other volunteers in an Airbnb in San Diego at the end of each day. When Rachel approached me, not only to translate, but help create a bilingual edition of her work, I was thrilled. I came to translation as the natural extension of being the child of immigrants, raised in a bilingual home. As I learned more about the theory and practices of translation, I grew enamored of the promise translation holds as an elementary stepping stone into a more just world. As Rachel demonstrates time and time again in her book, the language we use matters. This applies not only to individual words or even to a vocabulary of immigration, but to the languages that we use and the ways that we make ourselves open to languages other than our own, especially if we're used to living in a world that linguistically caters to our own. Translation Collective Antena Aide's description of a linguistically just world where a vast range of languages coexist and social structures would not be based on the dominance of one language over all others sounds a whole lot like the kind of world A is for Asylum Seeker invites us to collaboratively imagine. I like to think of my personal translation practice, which, in addition to A is for Asylum Seeker, has included helping Spanish-speaking survivors of the American immigration system reaching audience at work and online, and helping asylum seekers navigate a Byzantine system of applications and forms as a small step towards this kind of world. While language alone is not enough to fix the deep problem of phobia, white supremacy, and anti-immigrant sentiment, it is a first step. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Sally, to talk a little bit more about the illustrations in this fantastic book.
Thank you. My favorite part of the book was the ending, where it just lists, it's just resources that you can find per state. And I shared this before at the previous event, but my parents and I came to the US when I was 4. And fortunately, we had family that was stationed in Chicago. But just the amount of resources that exist in the, towards the end of the book, like I can only imagine how much help that book would have offered us if, it would have been written in 2002. But I just want to share quick graphics. So the first one is this one. So this is an actual photo, and it's of a young man who managed to climb the border wall, and it's kind of like resisting it. I kind of like just added the, it's a restricted area, no trespassing US government property, and he just has this fist in the air, in solidarity with, borders are a made up concept. This one is one of the internment camps that is down on the border states. And this one is titled Concentration Circus. I don't know if this one made the cut, but this is one of them. Yeah. So the Defend DACA sign, and then there's another, so White House right in the background. This sign and another sign that I'll share They're both, if you look up like Defend DACA or Dreamer signs, you'll see this particular image because it's from a couple. They're photographers, and they go all over the US to protest, and they kind of bring that same sign. So it's visible in a lot of signs. This one in particular, this Black man is actually an activist from Ferguson, showed off in front of just a lot of military police. The bottom images are little, kind of like the smaller, like tear gas, basically. And this tear gas is made in the U.S., and you can see it in any country where there's state repression used. So kind of added some, dual symbolism there. This is another one of the border state here in the U.S., but the officer is actually a military police from Palestine. Hence, like the large weapon. Another one. This one is from Palestine. This was also actually my first time working in strictly black and white. So it was also fun to just challenge myself with the ability to create art in black and white. The image of the Palestinian holding up the flag, Instagram would load. So this is actually my face. Joe Pesky, an awesome artist, took that picture of me at an event, and so I was like, how can I, see myself and exist, past this world in a book somehow? And that was that.
Cecilia, I'm just going to cut you off for 1 sec. Sometimes when you hold up the drawings, you are we can't hear you. So
okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
Thank you. I'll just share. So some of the ones that didn't make the cut for the cover, this one right here. I know, like, I wanted to honor, like, Rachel's like, I have an idea, maybe like a little alphabet block from, when we're younger. And so this one was one of those. So it was just really exciting to kind of be a part of this project. And when I met Rachel, I had actually met with her at a coffee shop to give her some prints of a drawing that I had made of their family. And I was like unemployed because my DACA hadn't come. And it was just a really strange, time in my life, and like feeling like ni de aquí, ni de allá. So I'm not from here, not from there. What do I do? Where do I exist? And I think Rachel really grounded my existence with just like the invitation to participate. And this is actually the picture that was where it's from. So thank you. More than anything, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this, and just allowing me to exist and represent, all of your beliefs and my beliefs within the same world.
Thank you both for very beautiful comments. Isli, we actually met before that. I don't know if you remember, but you came to our Jewish Voice for Peace had a night out of darkness right after the election in 2016. And I didn't know you. Like, I had contacted Young People's Resistance Committee, and they were like, we'll send this person. And I was like, okay. And then you came, and you were just this ball of fire. You spoke so beautifully. And, that was a really, I think as activists, we organize all kinds of events, and some of them are good and some of them, but that one we were all just so freaked out after the election. And that event was such a beautiful night, and your fiery, passionate words were so striking. So I was so pleased to get to work with you again.
Thank you. We did work again when you invited the Young People's Resistance Committee right after everything happened. We were trying to make UWM a sanctuary campus.
Oh yeah.
And I remember you invited us to your, it was like a board meeting.
The Faculty Senate, yeah.
Yeah, and we kind of just took over that meeting, and and you gave us that space. So, thank you for always offering us that space to just be seen.
Was that the one where you came and they had all those university police there? Yeah, I remember that really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, still chewing on that one. So just so everyone knows, I put in the chat Yusli's website where much of her art and craft work can be found, and also Alejandra's blog, which I read, which is beautiful, Ojos de Santa Lucia, which are really just some wonderful writing there. And Alejandra, I was reading your blog this week, and I found this quote that's so beautiful about translation, and I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna see her, I can ask her about this. So this is, I think, from your most recent blog. I subscribed, so it was in my inbox, so I think it's the most recent one. So you write, translation is something we do with our bodies. You work through a text on gut feelings and inclinations and ideas, finding something that feels right to you, a kind of affective certainty that, at least for me, washes away as soon as you've seen your work printed in black and white. That was such an interesting and really embodied idea about translation. I wondered if you could talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of reading of translation theory, in part because I think it's really interesting, and it's one of the ways that I went to grad school and everything, but I still have this idea that I don't get theory, or academic theory is always a little over my head, but translation theory is something that I always am yes, I know what that feels like. I know embodiedly what that is. And so I'm reading this book. It's called The Translator's Turn, and in it, this guy is basically a lot of translation theory that we think about or listen to right now is this very Christian, the source text is the word of God, and from that you must not derive. And that's not actually how translation works when you're in the middle of it. It's impossible to do a one-to-one translation. There's all this knowledge that we sort of have about how translation actually works. And he talks about translation being this thing that you, it involves your body, and it involves this historical knowledge, and it involves all of when I am translating house to casa, I'm usually picturing something specific, and the author was picturing something very specific when she was I lived in my house. And there's a difference not only between the English and the Spanish, but between an English and another Spanish, and that gets repeated again in the reader. And so it just felt really important to me to remember that this isn't, in as much as I'm trying to stay faithful and honor and respect the words that I'm translating, it's also something that comes from me and comes from my body and comes from my experiences, and that is how there is no way to just be this clear filter for language. There's always going to be me in there, and that is also an important part of the process that I get to honor and I get to look at and think at. And then of course there's always the anxiety of the printed object where you're oh, did I mess up the language, or did I translate that right? Does that even make sense now? I'm sure you're familiar with that, between the ideas that you're having in a writing session that you feel is going really well, and then seeing your book all bound up and being oh, did I really mean that? Did I really want to say it that way? And yeah.
It's really interesting. So it gets transformed, of course, in the translation. And yeah. I think that, the other books I've written have been academic books because that's what the profession is like. And this book is a book that's informed by my being a professor who thinks about immigration all the time, but it's not strictly an academic book. So seeing it in print is really different for me than the other ones. The other ones do feel a little I don't know, people say I'm reading your book and I'm but this one feels different because I worked really hard thinking about who would read it. And part of that was the work with you in translation, but I really thought about wanting as many people as possible to do whatever they wanted with this book, which is really different than writing for an academic book. It's kind of the opposite. Wanting as few people as possible to think I'm really smart, but not as, it's this weird kind of meritocratic thing. And, it's not that I feel very passionately about the last book I wrote, Against the Deportation Terror. It's about a bunch of people that I think are real heroes and immigration advocates at mid-century. But something about writing in that voice does feel like it becomes really cold when it gets bound into a book. This doesn't feel that way to me exactly. It feels still yeah, that's actually what I meant to say. When I read it, I'm yeah, that's what I meant. So that's really different for me. So that's cool.
Yeah. No, I have been surprised. I haven't reread the book in its entirety since I finished translating it, but I have come back to it over and over again, both in my own writing and just like dipping into it. I actually ended up using the resources list for like a work project. Like it's something that I have been using like as a resource very frequently, and just like it feels so useful in my line of work. And especially like my organization right now is having the conversation that a lot of organizations are having about like, how do we think about racial justice and equality? And I'm like, it's in the book. Like we can see this history of policing that has come down from like the fugitive slave laws to today, and like we can draw all these lines really clearly. And there's always this like anxiety with nonprofits or with people who like rely on funding to be like, can we say that? Are we allowed? Like, is that historically accurate? And it's like, yeah, it is.
That was like what you just did with the book, like that gesture. That's exactly what I wanted to happen. I'm done. That was my fantasy. People would be like, yeah, and so. So, Alejandra, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book you're writing? I know it involves translation and immigration and all kinds of related things.
Yes, it does. So prior to like becoming involved in immigration activism, I had done a little bit of translating, but not a ton. And then when I started working with New Sanctuary, helping people fill out asylum applications like in the basement of a church in Washington Square Park, that was the first time that I was like, oh, this entire side of me that was for my family, and like this whole language that was for my family, that was for home, that was not always for like walking around, it suddenly is like vibrant and political and important in ways that I had not necessarily realized, in part due to like my own family privilege and like the upbringing that I had, which was a little bit like, we never really lived in like super Latino communities. And so it was like not just this political awakening, but also this real like linguistic awakening. Like this is the way that I get to be fully present in all of my languages. This is the way that like all of my history and everything that like my parents have gone through and everything that I've gone through like comes to bear on this political moment. And also these are the ways in which it's complicated, and these are the ways in which like translation offers us this like beautiful promise that I kind of alluded to in the introduction that I read about like, we're all like together and we all speak one language, and when we translate works of literature, it's like this beautiful, like utopic, we're so open-minded, whatever. And then the reality of it is like sitting in a church basement with someone being like, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you? And then I'm gonna write it down in 300 word little chunks for like this horrible little application that some bureaucrat's going to read and like decide if they feel like saving your life or not. And so that discrepancy between the ways that we think about and talk about translation, and that discrepancy between the Spanish I speak with my family and the Spanish I'm speaking in the world and the different ways, just seemed like a really rich place to discover and think about. And so the book starts in that basement, and then I talk a lot about our trip to Tijuana. I also had the opportunity to go to a detention center for work a little while ago, one of the big privately owned ones in the South, and just the experience of being there and seeing just like dozens of incarcerated men who were all 100% not supposed to be there, and them being like, well, at least I'm not dead, and being like, you get better, you get to ask for better, you get to do better. And I think all of those things tie into language and tie into privilege and tie into like all of these bigger conversations that we're having in this country right now. And so that is what that book is about, and also this book.
Wow. And when like do you have a like, is it coming out?
Not yet.
Okay.
I have an agent and we're doing edits and it's a whole thing, but someday.
Cool. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I guess all three of us are happy to take questions or just have a conversation with the folks who are here. I'm a professor. I could just talk, but I don't think anybody wants that.
We could keep it pretty casual. If you are all able to unmute yourselves, so if you just kind of want to join in the conversation, just pretend we're in our meeting room and we have our chairs in a circle.
Coffee and wine.
Yeah, I wanted to add a bit on like the importance of translation and just, and resistance. Like I think back to like when Mexico was being colonized, and the way that we learn about colonization is like they were being forced to learn a new language and they were being indoctrinated a whole religion. But I think like, historians at that time, they knew that if they learned the language, if they knew Nahuatl or their like traditional language, as well as like Spanish, how much of those texts could like exist and like transcend time almost. And so I was reading it's called The Five Sons, and they kind of share how the only way our people did not go insane was by using that language and the new language that they were being kind of indoctrinated upon, like to teach the youth and like to teach young people. And that's how I see like this book transcending that time, how the act of resistance to like interpret words for what they should be, and like the term xenophobia, right? Like how we saw it being used in 2020, and like with just the acts against our siblings and sisters that are like Asian Americans. But then we took back that term, and I see so many trainings now that like are in relation to xenophobia, and it's like bystander intervention trainings, and it's like the ability to transform with language in that way, to me, is like what we need to keep going, and just keep existing and resisting in that way, and like using language to our ability, or else they're gonna use it against us.
And I think that when we have presidential orders condemning anti-racist trainings and critical race theory, we know that we're succeeding, right? Like, that like the Orange Menace didn't know what critical race theory even was before Steve Miller said, hey, we got to, like these people are giving trainings, they're actually getting through, they're carrying on the Nawa tradition of resistance. Like that actually means that, that somebody's thinking like, we got to shut this down, which means that something is being accomplished. So I think that that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to your example, you said xenophobia means like fear of the foreign, or like fear of the other. And I feel like you see this all the time when you have like people attacking people for like speaking Spanish in public, and you have like this fear, and it's just this fear of the foreign. There's always like this kind of like, are they talking about me? What are they saying? And it's part of the thing that I am talking about when I am talking about language justice, is being used to the idea that it's not always about you, like linguistically, and that it is okay to be uncomfortable if you don't immediately understand something. And like, you need to, like, part of operating as a monolingual person in a space that is linguistically just is being like, I am going to hang out here and wait for a translation. I'm not going to like center my own understanding needs in this moment. And that's really hard. It's really hard to be in a space where everyone's talking a different language and you're just like, okay, eventually I will figure this out. But I think that's a really important lesson to learn and understand for people who are used to just having the entire world like come to them in English all the time and have those like immediate translations available. I mean, people go through entire immigration court cases without understanding a good chunk of the language, or having to wait for like a court interpreter over like little headphones or over Skype, which I've seen is horrible. And so I think that that's also a big part of it, is just learning to be uncomfortable and like embracing the otherness of like listening to other languages and being okay with that.
Yeah, I'm always both gratified and slightly horrified when you read your translator's introduction, Alejandra, because what I remember from that day in Tijuana is exactly that. Like, okay, my Spanish is okay. I thought it was a lot better before I got to Tijuana, but you know, that was pretty humbling. And then people are operating in French and Creole and a ton of other languages, and trying to be in that space and figure out how to work and how to be present in that space, and also deal with like being out of time with what's being said at any given moment. You know, that was an intense day. Those days are really intense, and really like you get tired really fast in another language rather than in your own. Like your energy level is like, your tank goes down much faster when you're like straining and translating and trying to figure out what people are meaning at any given time.
Does anybody have any comments or questions? Deb, you have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself.
Never learn. I'm now unmuted. So I'm Deborah McGee, and I was in Tucson. God, it was last year already. For the month of December, working at a shelter called Casa Alitas. I don't know if that's a group that you are aware of. They do incredible work, and it's advocacy, but it is also a place where the ICE groups and the Border Patrol basically dump people to hopefully get through the asylum process and help translate the forms. And you know, when they come to us, they come to us with no shoelaces, as you all I'm sure well know, no food. They haven't eaten in days. They're dehydrated. They don't have clothing. They're freezing, and they're terrified. And they thought that when I was there, and I think it happens all the time, they think that they're coming into another prison situation. And we work very, very hard to help them feel comfortable with what we're trying to do, because all we're really trying to do is help them get from point A to their sponsors in a safe manner. And it was very hard work. Everybody, almost everyone there was a volunteer, all the way from the medical folks down to the intake people. It's something that, when I came back, I was there for over a month. I came back and I was like a wild woman. I was raging on YouTube all day long. And I'm still doing work for and with immigrants. And so I think something like what you've done, Rachel, is make this horror more palatable for those of us who have no knowledge. When I was talking to people after I came back, people had no idea about what was going on at the border, none, and all horrified. And so getting a book like this out, that's not a literary piece, I think is really important. And I think it's something that, parents can share with their children, even if they what's the word I'm looking for? They abridge what the language is in the book. I think it should be in libraries and schools across the country, so that people understand what you know, what is going on, because people don't understand, they don't know. And once in a while there's coverage. CBS does one article, and so people go, oh, look at this, blah, 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 and then they just forget that it's real and that it is ongoing. And so I think it's extremely important. I think this kind of work is so important, really. And thank you so much, all three of you, for what you're doing, really.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. Yeah, this book really comes out of that unimaginable, in the many horrible things that have happened since then, moment of the so-called child separation crisis of late spring, early summer 2018, 2019. And the problem with that, that was a really interesting moment because people all around the country were mobilized around it. But I think the general thought was that it was unusual and that it hadn't happened before. And I think moments like that can be really important because they bring people to consciousness around these things, but I think it's hard to know how to sustain the work and the response and the rage, and it's hard to know where it comes from. Like, is this just, it's really easy to say, oh, it's Trump and Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III and they're terrible, which, you'll never be wrong. I'll always say you're right if you say that, but that's not really explanatory, and it doesn't give us much to organize with. Right. And the kind of like intersectional organizing that Yusli was talking about in trainings, where it's like, wow, the status of undocumented people. And, I've been in a lot of conversations giving talks around the country where I remember really clearly in Austin, and this is when the book before this came out in 2017, giving a talk at the University of Texas there, and these couple of women who were from the community, not from the university, coming and saying, well, we are preparing our attics to shelter people because we think that that's what's going to become necessary, right? And like they're looking for, I don't know, sort of historical allies and antecedents and way to understand the situation. And has ever anyone had to do this before? And yes, actually, like, there's many examples. You can go back to the piece I just read about the ways in which the Pequots figured out how to survive and who would take them in and who they could make common cause with. You can go back to Black and white abolitionists working in the North and the South to shelter and foster runaway slaves who are incredibly vulnerable. Like, at least from my high school Civil War education, the idea was that you got to the North and you were free, but that's not how it was. You were vulnerable to capture, as many undocumented people feel all the time, right? You run a red light or you take a right on red and it's a rolling stop, not a full stop. For any reason, you can be stopped and made vulnerable. And this is we tend to think of these things as exceptional when they're actually long-term standing practice, and they make our history. That's what our history is made of, those moments.
Yeah, there's the part in your book where you define caravan, una caravana, and just reading that, it brings back those images of like when we came to the U.S. with just relatives. We came to Chicago for maybe like 6 months so I could finish, I think, first or K5, like I was younger, but then I moved to Seattle because my dad just found a better job. And he gathered 21 family members living all over the US to kind of have a caravan and move to Milwaukee. And those, I think, to me, it was a 3-month vacation for me, but I didn't realize what my dad was actually doing. Like, he was gathering his village to travel from Nebraska, from California, from Seattle, everywhere, to kind of just come to like this one collective house. And it's the childhood home that I grew up in. We got really lucky because it was I call it a fourplex. It was like two duplexes put into one. And like, there was 27 people living there, 21 adults and like 6 kids running around that one village in Milwaukee. Like, and just that term, and seeing like, yeah, my dad did my dad created an entire caravan of relatives to bring to Milwaukee, and just the images of like all of the work vans back to back, like just following each other, the walkie-talkies between each other, like to me, it was an adventure. I was only 8 or 9 years old, but just reading that definition brought back those memories of like resistance. And so it's just, just beautiful.
It's a great story. Usually I put your webpage in the chat, but I don't know what all is on there. I haven't, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Yeah, so if you go on Instagram, if you have it, or Facebook, it's Adelitas_MKE. Adelitas is just the revolutionary woman during the Revolutionary War that fought alongside, their counterparts, and they just did badass stuff because they were badass women. And so when I was unemployed for those 9 months, I ended up hosting vendor markets with predominantly Latina, indigenous people, femmes of color, and women of color, and then like elder women who really aren't on social media that much, to kind of like help them. And at that point, the only way I was making, ends meet was just selling tiny concha, like pan dulce earrings, and like concha jewelry, and portraits. So I would do portraits of people, and it solidified my existence, because it made me realize that, like, we're gonna make it anywhere. Like, I think, the people that you talk to that said, like, well, at least I'm alive. There were days when I would wake up and just be like, well, at least I'm alive. And this Saturday, I'm gonna have a vendor market. I'm gonna get to, dress up like an Adelita, or whatever, and just like show up with my community. So it's kind of beautiful to see that unravel into, what it came about. So that's what I've been up to. I still do portraits and just commission art, but I organize with an awesome, an awesome nonprofit that like values the work that other nonprofits here in Milwaukee or in Wisconsin are doing. So it's what I do by trade, but it's amazing to see people support me, because they see, the importance of just resistance and existing here in Mexico, or wherever I'll be, just feeling that level of support has been amazing. Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who are not in Milwaukee or Milwaukee obsessed like we are, I tell people, well, back when I used to leave the city, which I haven't done in some time, that, Milwaukee is the election, that, Milwaukee is the reason we don't have Governor Walker right now, because of the organizing of mostly Black and brown folks on the ground. And Milwaukee is, one of our real hopes in 2020, really, because Wisconsin, as Milwaukee, if voters turn out here, then our state swings purple instead of red. And, that's what it is. So that work that you're doing, really important.
And Milwaukee just has a huge history of resistance. Like, before it was a conservative red state, it was a radical red state.
Yeah.
So, it's just a beautiful, I think it's a special city. Like, there's no city like it.
Well, I often say when I speak here about immigration things, like if you think about Milwaukee, which most of you who don't live there probably don't, that's okay. But there's 3 rivers that come in here, and it was always cosmopolitan. Like, before Europeans got here, it was a place of trade and a multi-ethnic, multilingual place. It's always been that. And I figured this out, like I knew it kind of intellectually, but one day I was driving down by the harbor, and I was like, all the rivers come in there, and like all the arteries, and I was like, oh, this is like a heart. Milwaukee is a heart. It's a beating heart with all these arteries, and it's always been a place where people were interdependent and interreliant. That is our deep history, and now it's hopefully the heart of a move away from our terrible current moment, but we'll see.
Good luck.
Does anybody else have anything? I did put a link in the comments to purchase the book for those of you that would like to. I highly recommend it. It's an amazing book. And do any of you have any final thoughts or comments?
Thank you all for taking the time tonight. And, there is I think it's on the webpage, not in the book, but if you do use this book for organizing or anything, if you buy like whatever, 10 or 15 copies, I will zoom in free and talk to your church or your synagogue or your cell. So Jennifer knows where to find me. I can actually put my email in the chat. So if you're doing that, I'm happy to come along, and we could maybe even get Alejandra and Yuseli to come talk to you. So we're up for doing this again if folks have the need or the interest.
Well, thank you. This has just been such a treat for us. And I also want to thank you, Yuseli. I didn't know you were going to be here. I would have had a whole introduction of you as well. It was just such a treat.
My bad. I'm sorry.
No, it's
I thought I emailed you.
It's okay. You know what? Like I said, this has been such a crazy time, but Rachel and Alejandra and Yuseli, thank you for coming here to our virtual library meeting room space, which I'm hoping we will have our regular library space back up and running. But as I always say, at these events, our silver lining is that we can have people here who we wouldn't otherwise. So where we would be having Rachel here this summer, we wouldn't be able to have the two of you with your wonderful input and interesting perspectives that you brought to this conversation. And for that, I'm very grateful for this kind of online space. So thank you both so much. We do hope that the Wellfleet Library will be open next summer. Rachel, I hope you get to come back and present this in front of a large room, and that we get to have that coffee. And I will, I'm sure that people are going to be interested in that last piece that you said about buying a batch of books and zooming in. So I will let you know if I hear anything about that.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thank you so much for organizing this, Jennifer. Thank you for having us.
Of course, anytime. All right, everybody, take care, and please vote.
Yeah, really.
Yes, please fill out the census too.
Actually, just for those of you who are here, Cape Cod, Barnstable County has the lowest census return rate in the entire state. And that's of great concern for those of us out here, and what it means to get those census dollars. We do have on our homepage, we have a link to the census, right, on our homepage, and you can fill it out online. Also, if you are not comfortable with that, when you get to the link, there's a phone number. You don't need that number that got mailed to you in order to fill it out. And also, when you fill out the census, your information will not be shared with any law enforcement agency. It will not be shared with ICE. It will not be shared with Homeland Security. So it is something for everybody to fill out, and it is incredibly important. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
And they're trying to stop counting everyone but citizens, so everyone should fill it out.
Absolutely, everybody.
Yep.
All right, bye everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.